and welcome back. Today's video is Pretty Dead Queens by Alexa Donne. I have to say, I've followed her on YouTube for a number of years now. I enjoy her writing advice. And so I was excited to actually read a book of hers because you know the whole saying, those who can't do, teach. So I was like, I want to know how good she is. When I started, I was into it. And overall, I felt like it was an easy read. We got through it quickly. I actually listened to it. Good audiobook. The narrator's one of my favorite narrators. She always does a good job. But I did end up disengaging relatively quickly. While it is a pretty straightforward, simple mystery, I felt like there were a lot of things left undone. I was let down by the lack of depth that I found in this novel. Because just because it's a straightforward, simple thing doesn't mean that we couldn't weave a tighter web, if you will. The main character is this girl named Cecelia. Cecelia is coming to live with her grandmother, Maura, because her mother has just died of cancer. She does not know Maura at all because Cecilia's mother was estranged from her mother, and they haven't seen each other basically since her grandfather died. And her mother got out of Dodge as quickly as she could have. And that's one point where I was a little confused, and it could be me. I thought we were leading up to something with why Cecilia's mother left. And there's a hint, but it's never fully explained. So we'll get into that, but I was a little disappointed that we didn't get further into that. But Cecelia is coming to live with Maura, and Maura lives in this massive house. It's this grand old manor that I believe has been passed down through her family. And the big thing about Maura is that she is a famous mystery writer. Her first novel was based on true events in which when she was in high school, she had been on the homecoming court, and the homecoming queen had been murdered the night of homecoming. Obviously, fictionalized version of events, but it made a name for her, and she has published prolifically since then. We do learn that there are a lot of mysterious deaths and disappearances in this town, which we do touch on that at the very end of the novel. But in retrospect, I thought that could have been a really nice undercurrent. I loved what we got at the end, but I wished we could have done more with it. In any case, Cecelia has not read any of her grandmother's books. She's familiar with them, particularly the very first one, but there's only one that she has read, and I kept waiting for that to become important. And it never really is, except it's just the one thing that she can say when people are like, oh, you haven't read her books, or oh, what have you read? While Cecelia could care less, this town is essentially fixated on Maura and her writing to the point where some of the people that Cecelia befriends, they have a tour in the name of her stuff. There's a whole conference that takes place every year surrounding her. You get to the school and she's donated all these wings. Like, she's a very prominent member of this society. I put some pieces together later, which hopefully I will remember to talk about. But again, I felt like, so the murder of the homecoming queen, the homecoming queen's name was Caroline Quinn. And while it's a very heavy presence in this novel, I wished we had investigated her murder a little bit further and that it had been a little bit more satisfying. Cecelia is in this house. She learns that Maura's personal assistant, Suzanne, is still with her, and she lives at the guest house. She also meets this guy named Ben, who is Maura's intern, and Ben goes to her school. Ben has some drama going on because they live in California, and there's a lot of landslides, and this particular town was affected by landslides, and his mother, if I remember correctly, I was honestly a little bit confused. They were behind on some kind of bills, so they had never evacuated their house. So his mother was killed in a landslide when their house got caught up in one. So now he and his grandfather are embroiled in a lawsuit because the mayor, apparently to save face, to be reelected, decided to use his money on temporary fixes. So this is why the landslide ended up occurring and his mother died. This has ostracized him from his friend group. And this friend group, and can I just preface this by saying, one of the characters' names is Bronte. I applaud Donne for trying to be cool like that, but Bronte, one thing, and this, I try not to really talk about personal things. I try to kind of stick to how the book reads. But one thing that bothered me about Donne's writing was she was very blatant about social and political issues. That's not how I care to have this stuff presented. I don't like an agenda, period. But if you are going to put your agenda in a novel, I would like it to be more subtle. So that bothered me. This whole idea of let's harken back to our literary roots and let me show off how literary minded I am by naming one of my characters Bronte. I thought it was a bit pretentious, but Cecelia gets to school. She's assigned a buddy named Amber. Apparently Amber has no time for her, so she jet sets, but like the one non-white girl in this school whose name is Bronte, who's absolutely stunning, befriends her instead. Of course, Cecelia has some choice words about Amber's desertion, only to learn that not only is Amber part of Bronte's friend group, but Amber is actually Bronte's girlfriend. Open mouth, insert foot. In the long run, it doesn't really matter. So she becomes friends with Bronte, Amber, Natalie, this dude named Luke, and this girl named Morgan. Ben is her love interest, and then Bronte's brother Gabriel is her other love interest. And where I started to disconnect was Cecelia point blank says, I'm just here temporarily. I'm not going to put down roots. I'm not going to form relationships. I will be here and do what I have to do, but then I'm gone. This is especially true for romantic relationships. So not only do we basically meet Ben right off the bat, and he becomes a romantic relationship for her, but we also meet Gabriel. And so now we have a love triangle of sorts. For somebody who straight up said, I don't want a romantic entanglement, to then have two romantic entanglements. In one respect, there's no clear winner, but then at the same time, it's like Ben's the one she wants. I couldn't connect with this mindset. So she befriends these people, and this is when she also learns about the rift between Ben and the friend group. And I will say there were a lot of characters. I didn't necessarily like how large this cast was, especially because they didn't really need this cast of characters. Luke in particular I thought was pointless. I feel like his storyline was really to lead into a social commentary of Donne's. Morgan, again, so Morgan is Natalie's best friend, and she's sort of imperative, but at the same time, I was like, who's Morgan and who's Amber? They felt very interchangeable to me. Of course, this friend group is the offspring of the town's high and mighty. Amber's father is the sheriff, and then her mother owns the local diner. Natalie's father is the mayor. Bronte's mother is the town's reporter. Morgan's mother. I forget what Morgan's parents do, but there's something else as well. Because of who these people are, Mora approves. We also meet a woman named Grace, who's kind of the secretary, the office assistant at school, and we meet a character named Joe Badecki, and Joe Badecki is the janitor who was accused and convicted of killing Caroline Quinn, who was the centerpiece of Mora's first novel. And we learned that Joe and Grace are actually siblings. We had Natalie's mother, who is the town therapist, and then we have Mora's super fans, this guy named Chris and this woman named Remy. There was a lot. It felt like we needed to have this big cast for namesake only, but we didn't dive into them to make them vital to the novel right off the bat, because nobody knows who really killed Caroline. Everybody just says it was Joe because Mora, apparently when she was interviewed, said it was Joe because he and Caroline had something of a romantic relationship and she spurned him or something. It's never 100% positive that he is the murderer. So I'm just thinking, well, who could it be? And my mind immediately jumps to Mora. It turns out she was second runner-up, but I was just like, well, why aren't we asking Mora about any of this? Anyways, Cecelia goes to school. She starts on a Thursday. We pick back up on Monday, and it is homecoming week. It's Spirit Week. So she walks in and she's like, what the heck is happening? Pardon me if I'm wrong about this kind of thing, but it's a week before homecoming and they're trying to vote on the homecoming theme that Monday? I know they're going to reuse decorations, so maybe that's why this is possible, but I'm pretty sure there's a homecoming committee in which they decide these things further in advance. But Cecelia walks in on all this chaos. It's explained to her, and this is before I figured out who any of these characters were, but Natalie and Luke were championing for one theme, and this guy named Caleb and Morgan, somebody else, were championing for like a Midsummer Night's Dream kind of theme. This Caleb was dressed as Puck, and he was talking about how he likes wood. And so I was like, is this an innuendo? Slight spoiler, definitely an innuendo. That was one of the only things that I thought that Donne was slightly clever about, except that it doesn't actually come into play until the very end. And I don't like that. If you are going to have a plot twist, a big reveal, I need some more threads woven in there so that I'm just like, oh my gosh, it was all right in front of my face. How did I not see it? Natalie comes over. I guess there's a twin day coming up, and Morgan is blonde. Natalie is brunette. She's like, well, hey, Cecilia's brunette. Maybe Cecelia and I can twin it out. So then they twin it out, and I guess she never told Morgan she wasn't twinning with her, but Morgan had gone and dyed her hair. It was a very unhealthy friendship in a way. Like, we are definitely getting antagonist vibes from Natalie. She's not a very nice person, but whatever. And she is also the one who has eschewed Ben from their friend group, even though apparently, I don't know, they had some sort of a relationship at some point. So we go through all of this. I mean, there's a lot to go through. And it's just all leading up to homecoming. But one thing that happens is there is a pep rally. Morgan, Bronte, and Natalie are all cheerleaders, but Amber is not. So Cecelia is sitting with Amber, and then Luke comes over and is like, guys, let's get out of here. There's something better to do. He takes them to the pool, and this is where they trick Cecelia into thinking, because the homecoming queen, because Caroline Quinn was drowned in that pool. This is when they trick her into thinking that somebody is drowning in the pool, so she leaps in to save their life, only to realize it's a mannequin. Everybody's laughing at her, but apparently it's all good-humored. To make up for it, so Luke is still friends with Ben, even though they don't really hang out in public, like they do keep in touch, but they run this murder tour because there had also been a movie made based off of Mora's book, and it had been made in their town. So he's like, hey, to make it up for you, we will let you take our murder tour for free. What she didn't realize was that it was actually a murder tour. She thought that they were just gonna like take her around town. So this is where we first meet their super fans, Chris and Remy. This is also where we first encounter Gabriel, Bronte's brother. Because Gabriel has like 3 defining characteristics, but really there's only 2. The third one is a mystery that's only sort of explained, so we'll get into that later. But he is a true history buff. So the fact that their history is based off of this murder, he just thinks is cheap. And the other is that he has 8 million jobs, because even though his mother is well known in the town, they are not wealthy. This is where we meet him because he is giving everybody on this tour dirty looks, and he's basically saying that's not real history. We need to focus on something that's actually worthwhile. I can't exactly remember where this falls into the book, but Ben is able to ask Cecelia out, but she also suggests they go do something else, and he's like, well, we can't do it because we'll ruin your welcome party. And she's like, what welcome party? And he goes, oh crap, I guess Mora never told you. Please don't tell her I told you. She goes to this welcome party, but it's not about her at all. It's just Mora inviting the high and mighty to her house. And this is where we meet the parents, like the important parents of the novel. I thought that the whole thing was pretty pointless. Ben's grandpa does show up. He starts making accusations against the mayor. But this really was just a moment where we could actually come face to face with these parents. Before the homecoming game, which Ben and Cecelia are going to go to together, so this is a couple days, like I guess homecoming game is on Friday, Mora insists that Cecelia see a therapist. Obviously, her mother has just died. So she makes an appointment with Natalie's mother, and this is the day of homecoming. I'm like, how in the world, RIP to my pen, how in the world she's fitting all of this into her day, I don't really know. But she goes to see the therapist. There's nothing unique about it except that this is kind of how we learn how rich Natalie is. In essence, Natalie has 2 houses. There's a beach house and there's a regular house. The question is, are your parents actually together? Yes, they are actually together. But for some reason, they still have 2 houses in the same town. The beach house, her room is nothing special. And she hasn't even taken the time to redecorate it now that she's older. It's kind of an homage to her as a young girl, but it's really the only thing about her that has personality. Because then we get to the regular house, and because her parents took the master at the beach house, she gets the master at that house. And I was just like, why would she need to have a master at all? I could not keep up with which house was which, but the house in which she does not have the master is the house in which the mother is holding her therapy sessions. So Natalie is like, hey, I'll take you there. Cecelia had wanted to go home to change to look nicer for her date with Ben, but she couldn't because Natalie was like, there's no time and I can't be late. And I was like, this felt so unnecessary, except we need to get insight into Natalie. So what we do see is that Natalie is in this childhood bedroom. She's on her computer and she's like, yeah, I know this computer's old and doesn't fit into my lifestyle, but it really works. And then she gives Cecelia a makeover. They go to the game. She's sitting there. Well, she goes, but then Ben's like, hey, actually, I can't hang out with you. I've got to go do this thing. It's revealed that he's the mascot at this game. She's sitting there with Luke and Amber. The homecoming court is going to be announced. only for Morgan and Natalie to get into a fight because Natalie had dictated to Morgan what she could or could not wear. Only for Natalie then to copy what Morgan was wearing. And Morgan is not wealthy either. So Morgan had taken all this time to make her own dress, only for Natalie to buy a better version. Here we are setting the scene. Luke has already said, hey, I gotta get out of here. It's time for my halftime hookup. The next thing we know, halftime's almost over, and Cecilia's gotta go to the bathroom. But she does not want to have to wait in that long line, so she decides, hey, let me go to the pool. I bet you nobody is there going to the bathroom. So she goes only to discover a body in the pool. First thought is, oh, it's just a mannequin. Second thought is it's Morgan, because on this murder tour, Morgan plays the part of Caroline. No, it's neither a mannequin nor Morgan. It is Natalie. She freaks out and cut to the next scene. Next scene is essentially her deciding that she wants to become Nancy Drew. This is probably my biggest issue with the novel. Because why? Her explanation as to why she gets involved with this investigation is because she needs something to do. She needs something to take her mind off of her mother's death. And that felt like a very flimsy explanation to me, because while yes, the mother's death and this grieving process is a heavy presence, at no point leading up to this do we get the impression that she's antsy, that she needs a distraction, and that becoming an amateur detective is exactly what she needs to take her mind off of her mother's death. But according to Donne, this is why she decides that she needs to investigate Natalie's death. And this is when kind of the investigation of Caroline's death intertwines with the investigation of Natalie's death, because they mirror each other. They were both going to be homecoming queens. They both died in the same manner. They both died in the same place. This is when I thought it would have been nice to have gotten more of Caroline, because I know the main focus was really more about Natalie, but because it was such a mirror image of Caroline, I thought that we were going to get more, and this could be my misconception as to what kind of novel this was going to be, like a little bit more psychological thrillerness, a little bit more tension and suspense, in which, well, is the killer back? How are these deaths connected? And we don't really get that. The focus is on Natalie until Cecelia decides that she wants to focus on Caroline. And at some point, where the murders converge, but it didn't feel like it was an intentional craft, which is fine because it is a very straightforward murder mystery. But I just kept saying, why? Why does she need to be Nancy Drew? 100% of the reviews that I read had the same issue as to why did she need to become Nancy Drew? And that was literally what we all called her. I would say 90% of the reviews that I read also said that they didn't care about Cecelia. They didn't care for Cecelia. And that was problematic, because whether you like your main character or not, you need to connect with them in some way. You need to have a connection with them so that you want to continue on with their story. And I couldn't figure out who she was. I couldn't figure out why she mattered. The crux of the novel was really more about Caroline, in my opinion, than even Natalie, because at the end of the day, we had to figure out who actually killed Caroline. And it felt like Natalie was the vehicle to get us there. And then if you want to keep going with that analogy, Cecelia was the driver. She decides to become Nancy Drew, even though she has been warned by Sheriff Morrow, Amber's dad, to keep her mouth shut, because we can't be talking about this case Otherwise, we could jeopardize the case in terms of legal reasons. She doesn't care because she's Nancy Drew. So her first stop is the Weston Con. So her grandmother's last name is Weston. So it's the Weston Con, which is, wouldn't you know it, taking place the same time as when she just got, she's only been there like a week. She first thinks that she needs to talk to Chris because Chris is the obvious answer. Well, Chris has an alibi. However, you know who else is at this con? The sheriff. She's like, maybe I need to like get away from here. So she meets up with Ben at the local diner, but Sheriff Morrow also shows up because this is the diner owned by Amber's mother. He's like, serve me my coffee, wench. He kind of is trying to interrogate Cecelia. Ben has left by this point because Maura has called him away, only for Amber's mom to be like, hey, you can't be interrogating her here. But I believe this is also when Cecelia has run into Morgan, and Morgan is like, I was the actual target. But they couldn't tell because we have the same hair color, so they accidentally killed Natalie. To which Cecelia is like, well, if I could figure out that wasn't your dress, I'm pretty sure the killer could have too. But Morgan is getting really paranoid, and when Cecelia brings up these concerns, everybody's like, well, Morgan just has a really overactive imagination. We don't need to listen to Morgan. So she has a little heart-to-heart with the sheriff, and he's like, you need to stop talking to people. But she decides, hey, if I can't go through the front door, I'm gonna go through the back. Literally. So she tries to go through the back of the hotel, only to realize there's no way in. But wouldn't you know who she runs into? Gabriel. And Gabriel, wouldn't you know, he works at the hotel, so he lets her in. And they go to find the footage of the hotel from that night because they need to know Chris's alibi. They're unable to get it because the sheriff shows up again. They're able to stall long enough that he's able to slip her the thumb drive. But you know who else has also just shown up? Maura, Suzanne, and Ben. And now Cecilia's worried because Ben's gonna think that she's been hanging out with Gabriel. And for me, I'm like, why are you worried when you legit, every time you see Gabriel, you're just like, he's so fine. Like, I get the warm tinglies when I'm around him. I don't really know her thought processes. I don't know where she stands with all of this. She's a real fence sitter, and I don't care for fence sitters. But Ben's like, oh, well, I know he was handing you something. Like, he was just trying to sneak you something. And this is when I'm like, I kind of like Ben. He's different than all of the male love interests that we're finding in other novels. Well, there's a reason for that, if you are catching my drift. They are going to go watch the footage from the hotel, but not before Remy becomes a person of interest. Even though she's a super fan, she has some qualms concerning Maura and Maura's books, and she also at some point exposed some sort of fraud situation. So the thought is that maybe, and personally, I don't understand how any of this ties together, and I don't think it necessarily has anything to do with the writing so much as my attention span. But whatever the case, I don't really understand how any of this comes into play to make Remy a guilty party, a suspect, but it does. However, sorry, I feel like I'm super bouncy, but this is literally the sequence of events. This time, the sheriff actually does take her to the police station to interview her. And this is where she sees his murder board, and she's like, oh, I need a picture of that. She fails to get a picture of it, but she does make something of a scene, to which Amber's like, look, you were so obvious, and if you wanted pictures of the murder board, you should just talk to me because I have pictures of the murder board. She texts Cecelia pictures of this murder board, and Cecelia has also decided that she needs a murder board. So she goes home, and with Ben's help, they set up a murder board. There's a moment where Maura comes in, and they are suspecting Suzanne because they finally watch the footage, and Suzanne is seen at the hotel, and she's giving something to Remy. Maura's like, Suzanne was not involved. She was giving Remy an advanced copy of my book or something like that. I don't know why we really needed this, except we needed a lot of red herrings, and this was where I was like, is Maura even telling the truth? Like, my suspicious mind is just trying to make things a little bit more suspenseful. But Maura is, she's not very maternal, but she's loving the idea that Cecelia is following in her murder-minded footsteps. Sometime later, she runs into Bronte and one of the other girls, and this other girl wants to get her phone, but she hasn't been able to get it because it's at the scene of the crime. So they all have master keys to this school. Somehow, Natalie got master keys to the school and she distributed them out to her friends. So they use this master key, they get inside, and the idea of Natalie's locker pops up. One of the girls says, hey, but do you think the police know about her other locker? So they all go to the other locker only to find Natalie so she told Morgan could not wear a pink dress. Which is surprising because then she shows up to the homecoming parade in like a seafoam dress just like Morgan. So they get to this locker only to find the damaged pink dress, this destroyed pink dress. The police are called and all this good stuff. And then that night, Cecelia is supposed to hang out with Ben. But the girls are like, oh, you should come with us. We're going to Luke's. So they're going to Luke's where he's having a party with substances. All the others are kind of on these substances. And Cecelia says this is going to be a really good time to snoop through Luke's phone. She's able to get it, and she finds threatening messages between himself and Natalie. So he's got dirt on Natalie. Natalie's got dirt on him, particularly an eggplant and wolf emoji in which she's like, he says it to her, in which she's like, you wouldn't dare, and he's like, try me. But he also, and these texts took place the night that Natalie died, he threatens to kill Natalie if she ever tells. Now Cecilia's like, maybe Luke is the murderer. She gets a ride home with Gabriel because apparently nobody else can drive her home. He was working a wedding, so he just happened to be in the area because, as I said, he has 8 million jobs, so he's always in the right place at the right time. And this is when, to me, it's less of a very easy, straightforward murder read to highly convenient and borderline cheesy. I don't want Gabriel to be a love interest. Not that I don't like Gabriel. I think he's great. I think if he were the only love interest, I'd be completely fine. But I don't understand this love triangle that's not a love triangle. Of course, Ben is not jealous because her explanation is completely fair. And this is when I'm just like, Ben, I still kind of dig it, but I also don't get it. And now it's verging on annoying. The other strange thing is that even though the sheriff made a point to interview Cecelia right away, apparently Luke is also someone he wants to question, but Luke has just been kind of doing whatever he wants all day. And the explanation is, well, he's from a powerful family because his family owns a vineyard. So he's not as high priority to get into the questioning right away. Of course, Cecelia still has some questions. What she decides, because she wants to know, why was Natalie at the pool, and what's the deal with the whole halftime hookup? Like, because Morgan also was like, oh, well, I had a halftime hookup of my own. So she's like, what's going on with these halftime hookups? And again, why was Natalie at the pool? Like, there's no reason that Natalie would need to be at the pool. She convinces Ben that they need to go watch the CCTV footage. She says, well, I know someone who can get us in, who can help us, because Bronte had used her key to get them in. I forget exactly how this comes about, but Cecelia also gets a key of her own. And the understanding is that Ben does not have a key, but everybody else in Natalie's circle does have a key. I think what had happened is I'm a little ahead of myself. Cecelia goes to therapy again. And she's sitting there, and this I don't get, period. She's sitting there and she notices a camera. She's like, why is there a camera in my therapy session? It seems that Natalie's mother had no clue there was a camera in her office. What I don't get is if Cecelia, who's sitting there just like looking around, can see this camera on her second visit, how come Natalie's mother never noticed this camera? I get it. You're not always looking for things, but it obviously wasn't that well hidden. The mother gets called away. Cecelia is like, I want to know where that camera leads. Where does that footage go? She makes her way to Natalie's bedroom, and now we understand why Natalie was on this decrepit computer, like why she would have an old computer when she could have a brand new one. And she finds that Natalie has dirt on everybody in this town. Bronte had broken into the school computer system to get something for another student to help that student cheat. Luke has a secret. Grace has a secret. So Grace is the administrative assistant, Joe's sister. I mean, everybody's got a secret. And it looks like Natalie was using these secrets in order to blackmail people to get what she wanted. Which, here's a spoiler. Apparently, she didn't blackmail anybody. For me, she's painted as a really unlikable character. Very controlling, very mean girl-like. So it was plausible for her to have all this dirt on people and use it to get what she wanted because she was a selfish person. But then she never actually used this information. So this red herring was a huge letdown for me, and I hated the fact that it went nowhere, which is my overarching concern with this novel. Is we have a lot of good possibilities, but then there's no follow through, and I feel betrayed as a reader. This is why she knows that Cecelia can help them with the CCTV footage, because she knows that Cecilia's already broken into the system once to help this other girl. Oh my gosh, I'm so far ahead of myself. Let's rewind it a minute. She and Ben do go to the school, not to see the CCTV footage, but because she wants to know how long it would take to get from the stadium to the pool. They're doing their Nancy Drew stuff. She sees some flowers have been left, and she sees this figure, and she's like, the killer has been here. Chase after him, only to find out that it's Frank Quinn, Caroline's little brother. This is the anniversary of Caroline's death, which is why he's there leaving flowers. He and Cecelia have a chat, and then he makes up some excuse that causes Ben to have to leave because he doesn't want Ben to hear what he has to say to Cecelia, because Ben has ties to his community and family. Like his grandfather had been the sheriff at the time of Caroline's death. He basically says Joe could not have killed her. There's no way. This is when the cops come to the school and they're going to start talking to people. There's also a counselor there if anybody wants to talk to her, and both of these setups are going to occur in the library. Luke's name is called, and Cecilia's like, oh, I gotta go talk to the counselor about my mom. So she goes only to realize that they are in different areas of the library, so she eavesdrops on Luke's conversation with Sheriff Quinn. She also has overheard a heated discussion between himself and Morgan that leads her to believe that they are together, but basically they have a secret that they're trying to keep. And then she overhears him telling the sheriff that he was with Morgan. So now we're thinking they are the halftime hookup. This is also where we run into Grace, and she says some things that get Cecelia wondering if maybe Grace killed Caroline, or like Grace is somehow involved in Natalie's murder. She also tells Cecelia that her mother had done a psych paper on Caroline's murder and had gone and talked to Joe at the prison. And so I'm just like, there was so much missed opportunity concerning Cecilia's mother. And I was waiting for this little side story of her mother having an interest in the murder to come into play, to come to fruition, to really play into the end result. That perhaps what she found was why it drove a wedge between herself and her mother. Never really explained, but I will get there in the end. This is when she then goes to therapy and she sees the camera. Instead of having Suzanne drive her home, she goes to Ben's and they get a text message that says Suzanne was in an accident. Cecelia says, well, I want to look into the history of this town so that I can understand Caroline's murder. As the best person to do this is Gabriel, but she can't get in contact with Gabriel because he's being questioned. Eventually they do connect. He takes her where she needs to go, and this is when she runs into Remy again. This upsets her, so she leaves, only to go upstairs and overhear a conversation between the mayor and one of his assistants. And this is when we're learning that he's having some kind of illicit affair. And he doesn't understand why she's talking to the police about it. And she's just like, well, I can't see why I shouldn't. Also reveals to her that Caroline had insulin in her system, which means that it could have been anybody who murdered her, because the insulin would have incapacitated her to the point where you didn't necessarily have to be stronger than her to overpower her. And then this is when they break into the school to see the CCTV footage. And this is where we're going to get into some bigger spoilers. We see Natalie arguing with her father. Apparently they were arguing over the dress because, and this is something I don't quite follow either because it wasn't explained well or I wasn't paying attention, but she'd had two dresses, and I don't know if her whole plan was to have a pink dress and then tell Morgan she couldn't have a pink dress only so she could have two dresses and show up to outshine Morgan. I think that's really what happened, but she had spent way too much money on a dress. Her dad was not happy, but she's been eavesdropping on her mom's sessions, so she knows that her dad is having an affair. She uses this as a way to get him off her back. She walks away. We see Luke going in a direction. We see Gabriel coming out. We don't know where either of them are headed, except that Luke must be going to his halftime hookup. And then we see Morgan, and Morgan has a little moment with Natalie's dad. For me, this was another letdown moment, because why do we overhear an argument about an illicit affair when the furthest these two have gone is making out? And apparently this was the only time. That argument and this whole idea of him having an affair naturally makes you think that this affair had been going on a lot longer and involved a lot more than what it did. Not to say it was okay, but I felt extremely misled towards the nature of this affair. I mean, if the first time that they ever did anything was at this football game and all they did was make out, aside from the fact that she's not 18 and he's married and he's her best friend's father, like, it's just making out. Whatever the case. From here, we have Natalie's viewing. Cecelia is getting kind of frustrated with the whole situation. She shows up to this viewing and she makes a massive scene and she reveals everybody's secrets. The only secrets that she doesn't know are Gabriel's and Ben's, because Ben had caught on to the fact that something was going on, and so he decided to stop seeing her mother. But what's revealed here is that Ben and Natalie had been doing the dirty this entire year that he'd been shunned, and the eggplant wolf emoji from Luke was because they did a Midsummer Night's Dream, and Ben had been one of the wolves, so obviously she'd been shtipping him this whole time. Like, none of this can get out because of the enmity between himself and his grandfather and her father. So it would just be a huge mess to know that she'd been fooling around with a pool boy, essentially. She makes a big fool of herself, is taken home, and is woken the next morning, which is the morning of the homecoming dance, by Ben. And he's like, I've got something for us to do. Let's go visit Joe Badecki in prison. So they get there, and she ascertains he is not the murderer because he knew nothing about the insulin. So now it's kind of like back at square one. Who could the murderer have been? Hey, it's probably Grace, because Grace was a candy striper during this period. And Grace's husband ended up being somebody else's date. There are all these really weak threads tying to Grace. And I had already considered Grace. But then I was like, none of this makes sense. I don't see how it could be Grace. We're going to this homecoming dance, and we still don't know what's what. But it gets awkward real quick because Cecelia has to see all of her friends, and of course they all forgive her except for Luke, who's kind of wary of her. But everybody's like, we totally get it. We don't understand why you're so obsessed, but like, don't worry. Gabriel shows up and he's looking super fine. She's there with Ben. Since Morgan was not Luke's halftime hookup, we learned that Caleb, the guy who likes wood, it was Luke's halftime hookup. Very few people know that Luke is bi. Nobody knows that Caleb has any interest in boys whatsoever, and this is a small-ish town, so he has no interest in anybody knowing until he's long gone. And for me, this was one of those moments where it felt like Donne was pushing an agenda. Cecelia gets a text message from the murderer, and the murderer's like, you need to go to the pool. So she goes to the pool, and Gabriel shows up, and she's like, oh my gosh, Gabriel's the murderer. She pushes him into the pool, runs away, runs into Ben, and Ben's like, well, I've got somewhere we can go. He takes her to his home. Not the one where he lives with his grandfather, but the one where his mother died. And he's like, I come here every now and again when I need to escape. Well, they get their business on. She wakes up and she's got all of these texts from Bronte. And Bronte is like, look, Ben, he wasn't at the game. He was not the mascot at that game. There are two different people who play the mascot, and he was not the mascot for that game. So now Cecelia is like, pardonnez-moi? He has gone to get snacks. What that means, I don't know. Like, did he leave the house, or did he somehow have things stashed there because he sometimes visits the house, even though it's unsafe? Like, that is still on the verge of falling into the ocean. So she goes through his dresser drawer, his nightstand drawer, and here's another moment where she's like, I'm assuming they used protection. She opens the drawer and sees a whole box of protection. It's like, even though I'm an adult enough to make these decisions, like, I can't look at this box. I'm like, why do we need to have this moment here? But aside from the box of condoms, she finds a very familiar looking key, and it is the master key to the school. And she's like, how in the world does Ben have a master key to the school? He's not supposed to have a master key to the school. And this is where puzzle pieces fall into place, and she's like, he's totally the murderer. He comes back and she's like, I'm gonna go to the bathroom. He says the only bathroom that has not been used, because if you know, whenever a house does not have power or water, you get one flush. And he's like, the only bathroom I have not tried to use is the bathroom in my mother's room, and he's obviously not gonna go there. So she goes there and she's just trying to think things through. But wouldn't you know it, she left her phone in his bedroom. She's pacing back and forth trying to figure out what to do. I think that this whole side of the house has like a gaping hole in the back of it, because this is where it was falling into the ocean. Ben confronts her and he's like, so they've been blowing up your phone. I know you know the truth. And she's like, how in the world could you have done it to her? And he goes, first off, you were never actually supposed to discover the body. That was just a happy accident, but you were my muse, and I murdered her because of her father's inaction as mayor, and it caused my mother's murder. She's like, your mom wasn't murdered. Your mom's death was an accident. But he, I guess, has gone cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and he just doesn't want to hear it. They get into a scuffle, and he is going to throw her out of the house. He's going to throw her to her death. He's the one who ends up slipping out of the house, but then he like starts crawling up her body, and she's like, oh my gosh, we're both gonna die. But wouldn't you know that Bronte had texted her, and the one word she had texted back was Ben. So somehow Bronte, all of their friends, and the police know to come to his collapsed house versus where he lives with his grandfather, and they come to the rescue. Ben is something of a sociopath in which he's able to fool everybody, so now he's trying to put this act on and blame her for the murder and for trying to kill him. Nobody believes it. He's put in handcuffs. One thing I'd forgotten to mention, this is something that Bronte had also texted Cecelia, was that Ben's alibi was that he was with Maura, and Maura vouched for Ben. Cecelia gets home, and Maura's like, how was the dance? I hope you're coming home late because you and Ben had a good night. Except she was a lot more explicit. And I was like, excuse me, Maura. And then Maura sees the dress, and she's like, what in the world happened? Cecelia tells her how Ben tried to murder her. And then she starts thinking, wait a minute, Maura vouched for Ben when Ben murdered Natalie. So they obviously weren't together. Maura, you killed Caroline. I'd already figured this out. Honestly, the lack of attention given to Maura was my first clue, considering how close Maura was to the murder, but we never broach anything. I think there's like 2 conversations in which anything is even brought up. So I was like, obviously Maura has to be the murderer because there's jealousy of some sort involved and murder of opportunity. So yes, Maura, she's like, oh, I'm so proud of you. Not only did you figure out Benjamin, you figured out me. And then she reveals that she killed her own husband. She killed Cecilia's grandfather because she needed to know what it was like when somebody hung themselves. So, process of elimination. Every murder in one of her books correlates back to a murder she would have committed, so now she's a serial killer. And I was like, mind blown? Totally cool. Why did it have to happen in the last 2% of the novel? Again, I liked that it was a straightforward mystery. But then you tack all of this on at the end without even trying to dive into it. The only other thing that we got was that mysterious deaths and disappearances had happened in this town and kind of surrounding areas. So you're like, oh, remember that throwaway line at the beginning of the novel? That was our clue that there's a serial killer around here. To be fair, Caroline's brother Frank does think that a serial killer killed Caroline, which he's not wrong, but at the same time, he's also not right. It's not Ted Bundy or anything, because it doesn't work out for Bundy's timeline, and it doesn't work out for anybody else's timeline. So maybe that's also supposed to be a clue that Maura was a serial killer, but I don't know. I thought the end was really great. I really enjoyed the fact that we learned that Maura's a serial killer, but I thought we could have done more with it to make the book a little bit more interesting and give it more depth. And again, to highlight Caroline's murder. It does become a much heavier presence, but it's very one-dimensional. We don't really get much because every single suspect Cecelia comes up with for both Natalie and Caroline, she automatically is able to cross off the list. So I'm like, you're not a very good Nancy Drew. However, Maura thinks she's an excellent Nancy Drew. And she tries to bargain with her. And she says, here's the thing. If you keep your mouth shut, you can have whatever you want because I'm a very wealthy woman. You can go whatever school you want. I will set you up for life. Unfortunately for her, Cecelia has a conscience and morals. And so she's like, not gonna happen. Mora comes after her. She grabs a knife, and at the very beginning of the book, she'd helped Cecelia move in, but she has a dumbwaiter that she turned into kind of like a luggage elevator. And she was like, I can't get up and down these stairs anymore. I just stay on the bottom, but you're at the very, very top. So she's chasing Cecelia around this house, and Cecilia's like, so much for those bad knees. She does manage to catch Cecelia in the calf with her knife. They struggle. Cecelia kicks Mora down the stairs, but Mora comes after her some more, and then they have a scuffle near this dumbwaiter, at which point Mora is tossed down the shaft and she does die. Now we are wrapping things up. What happened was, all of this was discovered by Remy, because even though Remy is a true super fan of Mora's, she's also an FBI agent. What she says is, I am a true fan, but I'm also kind of here off the clock because I am an FBI agent, and those skills led me to be able to connect the dots between what I was reading in these books and these mysterious murders that were happening. It's sometime later, enough so that Cecilia's stitches have come out, and she's like, oh my gosh, my scar is like super puckery and itchy. Suzanne is sticking around. It turns out that Mora had tried to kill her. Cecilia's thought had been that the grandchildren of anybody involved in Caroline's case were being come after. I don't really know why Suzanne's brakes were cut. I don't know if it had anything to do with Cecelia, or if it was really just Mora maybe testing another murder theory. It doesn't matter. Suzanne decides to stick around, and because Mora was arrogant enough to think she would never die, her facetious will states that Suzanne is the executor of her estate and Cecelia gets everything. Again, that was a little too clean, too easy for me, but I do want to back it up just another minute more, because my thought was Cecilia's mother, in pursuit of whatever she was pursuing, and with the intent of writing this psych paper, discovered that her mother was a serial killer, discovered that her mother had killed Caroline, and this is why she wanted to get out of Dodge, and this is why she had a falling out with her mother, but that's never confirmed. All we know is that Mora does not think much of her daughter. She doesn't think her daughter has much spine. She thinks Cecelia is far more worthy. She was able to get Joe to admit that he killed Caroline, or at least do prison time by threatening him with Grace's life, which again, I felt was flimsy, but that's how Joe has remained in prison this whole time, and she has been visiting him, so I guess this is how she's keeping that link going and that threat alive. So now Cecilia's like, well, I'm not gonna live in that house, I'm just gonna move into the carriage house with Suzanne, we'll figure things out. Remy is telling her about her murder list, basically trying to line up these murders that would have happened around the same time as Mora's research to figure out who Mora was responsible for. And they're talking about her going to college. She's like, well, what they don't know is none of this is gonna stop me. I'm gonna continue and investigate. And she wants to, I guess she's considering Mora's money as blood money, so she wants to somehow give back to the community, and she feels like it wouldn't be right to tear down Mora's house, so maybe this can also be something she can give back to the community. And she has officially gotten together with Gabriel. So in the end, he was a love interest for a reason, but at the same time, I just thought this novel needed finesse, more finesse than it had. And I think simple novels can have finesse. I think really Donne was trying to do too much. She had a lot of great ideas. I don't think she realized them to their full potential. So that is Pretty Dead Queens. Not the worst book I've read, not the best book I've read. Love to know what you think. Bye!